Today we are here with Professor John Wood of the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies. Professor Wood is the NESA Center's foremost expert on Afghanistan and American foreign policy, domestic policy, and national security. Professor Wood brings to the NESA Center a wealth of experience, including 28 years with the U.S. Army, retiring as colonel, working at the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in addition to working 2 years on National Security Council, both under President Bush and President Obama. Today we're here to discuss with Professor Wood what the impact of the presidential transition is going to be based on the fronts of national security and foreign policy. So Professor Wood, we know that President Obama is the leader of the Democratic Party. Considering how tricky the current domestic policy is between Democratic leaders and Republican leaders, what do you think is going to be do you think there are going to be any impacts to the presidential transition period on American foreign policy and national security, especially considering if the next president-elect is not going to be so aligned with President Obama's policies or going to be a different political party?
Well, that's an interesting question, and one that I've taken a fair amount of time to look at, going all the way back to the end of World War II, through the Cold War, and then up to the post-Cold War period. And what's interesting, what you see that's quite interesting, is that independent of political philosophy or political party, the leadership of the United States has been in broad and deep agreement on both the overarching values of the United States and the overarching United States national interest. If you were to look at documents from Ronald Reagan's presidency, for example, he discusses the values, the enduring values of the United States as human dignity, personal freedom, individual rights, prosperity, the pursuit of happiness. And if you were to look at documents from President Obama, arguably diametrically opposed in terms of political philosophy, he uses almost the exact same language to talk about the enduring values of the United States. And it's from those values that we determine and derive our national interest. You know, and once again, I would say if you go back and look at documents and speeches and policy statements from all the way back to President Truman through the 1960s and up to the present, you would see that these enduring interests remain the same as well. President Obama defines them in both his 2010 and 2015 national security strategies as prosperity, as values, as international order, as security. And the words that he uses to describe in both the 2015 and 2010 versions of his national security strategy, security, prosperity, values, international order, are in some case nearly verbatim to the language used by either Ronald Reagan or President George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush 41. So why am I raising all this? Well, my point is that these values and interests are enduring and consistent. Now, what changes? What changes from a Democratic administration to a Republican or vice versa? Well, what changes is the personality and style of the president. What changes and what reflections you see of that style or that personality tend to play out in terms of what instruments or elements of national power that particular president wants to emphasize, or what's sort of their default position. What do they want to go to first? And so just to review, the instruments or elements are the diplomatic element, informational, military, economic, financial, intelligence, law enforcement. And so where one president may want to go in and say, for a strong security, we need a strong military, and therefore we need to be very prepared to quickly respond militarily. That might be considerably different from another president who says, I want to use my military as my last resort, and therefore my first and foremost effort is going to be diplomatic or financial or economic. As we go into 2017, I think that the reality of the world today is that you don't have the luxury of being a single instrument type of president. In fact, you have to be willing to draw and choose from all the instruments of national power. That's why we've seen over the last 10 years in particular, maybe even longer than that, the importance of things such as economic sanctions or the multilateral organizations, the efforts in the United Nations or the efforts of NATO, et cetera. So it's a long-winded answer, but I think that boils down to probably not much, right? The style and substance, the style might change, but the underlying substance in terms of the enduring values and interests of the United States will remain constant.
We see that President Obama's foreign policy has changed quite considerably over the last 8 years. As we're entering the final phase of his presidency, do you think there are going to be any changes that President Obama is going to make to his national security policy?
Probably not in the macro sense. I think that, as is the case with any presidency, independent of party, these last 6 months or so are about the preservation and maintenance of legacy. For President Obama, much of that is domestic policy and domestic legacy. But certainly, there's an international security and foreign policy aspect to it as well. So would I anticipate a significant change? Probably not. But we are seeing some adjustments, some would say on the margin. So the adjustment in the rules of engagement and the employment of air power in Afghanistan, for example, is one indicator. In the next 2 weeks, we'll see the NATO summit. That'll be a good indicator of whether President Obama is willing to make an adjustment in the troop withdrawal plan from Afghanistan. There may be some changes in the actions against ISIL, but I don't think so, because I think the general administration assessment is that the current policy and strategy is succeeding, albeit taking a long period of time. They're generally seeing good progress in their eyes, and so I don't think that there will be a major change in terms of ISIL. And our global counterterrorism efforts, frankly, have remained fairly consistent over the years. What I mean is the protection against domestic attacks in a global context, and so I don't see any changes in that. So in the remaining 6 months, probably not a significant adjustment. Now, were there to be some catastrophic event, were there to be a 9/11-like attack emanating from outside the United States, from a well-defined perpetrator, then I think that there's the likelihood that the president would act, and would act strongly and forcefully, as we would expect any president to do. But absent some major catalyst, I think that it's going to be steady as she goes, and work on maintaining and preserving the legacy at this point.
Every new president has a certain break-in period. How long do you think it will take the new president-elect to establish a foreign policy team in his or her administration? And building upon that, what do you think are the most important advisors?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it's one that becomes harder to predict the more volatile and contentious the environment is in Washington, the more polarized that it is. Over history, most president-elect, by the end of the calendar year in which they're elected, so in this case, by the end of December 2016, the president-elect, whoever that is, will probably be fairly well settled on who the major cabinet secretaries and probably the deputy secretaries will be. The Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury being the three, I would say the three key in terms of foreign policy and national security. Once again, emphasizing this increasing importance of the economic and financial instruments of national power in terms of the Secretary of the Treasury and foreign policy and international policy. So those will be the key. I think those will be fairly well settled by the end of December, but then the challenges are, how do you, since they require Senate confirmation, what will be the scheduling and the pace, and just how contentious will those confirmation hearings be? In most cases, historically, the Senate has given quite a wide degree of deference to the incoming president, regardless of party, in terms of the major cabinet secretary level appointments, the cabinet appointments. So I would expect that the secretaries at that level will be fairly well decided by the president by the end of this calendar year, president-elect, and by the time the president is sworn in on the 20th of January, will then be in place to quickly have those nominations taken up by the Senate. The other big challenge, though, is the deputy secretary or the assistant secretary level and below. this is my assessment, just sort of my turn here, but those are the doers, right? The cabinet level secretaries are the policy people and the major players in terms of influencing the president. But those in charge of actually implementing the policies, making things happen, are the assistant secretary, the deputy assistant secretary level. And those sometimes can take 2, 3, 4, 6 months into the administration for those to get settled and confirmed by the Senate. So at that strata, we might not see a well-formed, fully filled out policy team by the early part of the summer, perhaps. Now, equally as important, you asked who are the key influencers or who are the most influential. Equally important are those advisors to the president who do not require Senate confirmation. So the White House Chief of Staff, the National Security Advisor, the White House Counsel, all of those who are on the personal staff in the executive office of the President of the United States that do not require Senate confirmation. And they tend to be, historically, close personal advisors with deep relationships with the President established well before the actual inauguration. So, cabinet secretaries, the deputies and assistant secretaries, but then also the people that are actually closest to the President on a day-to-day basis, the Chief of Staff, the National Security Advisor, the Deputy National Security Advisor, the White House Counsel. In addition, we've had a president in the past, or several, that have referred to their so-called kitchen cabinet. Those unofficial, not elected, not appointed, but nevertheless quite influential personal advisors to the president. This new president coming in, whichever that might be, probably will have quite a few of those as well, particularly in this first stage of first 6 months or so. So it'd be important to sort out who those are and keep an eye on who both the formal influencers, the formal decision makers and policymakers are, as well as this informal network.
I think you'd agree that this campaign season has been particularly crazy. What do you think other governments are going to expect regarding policy changes within the presidential election transition period, especially considering if there are key differences between the new president-elect and President Obama?
I think because this has been such a contentious election already, and we're not even to the general election yet, but because this has been such a contentious general election, and because there are such stark contrasts between the candidates, even during the primaries, there are stark contrasts within the parties, that there perhaps is a tendency to think that whichever candidate prevails, there will be some marked change or dramatic shift in starting day one in January. And I would caution that that's probably an inaccurate read of the history and the structure of the United States government. The president, whoever that may be, that arrives in January of 2017, is one of 3 parts of our government, represents one of 3 parts of our government. And so we've already talked about the period of time that it's going to take to establish the policy team. It's going to take a certain period of time for the administration itself to coalesce, even if those key players are well defined and confirmed early on. But equally as important, and what I think our foreign partners and allies should keep in mind, is that in terms of major shifts in U.S. policy that require resources or new authorities, the Congress must be, and has to be, constitutionally must be, a key partner with the president. So we can have a president that arrives in office on the first day and makes a bold pronouncement in his or her inaugural address. But I would just caution that if it requires significant resources, if it requires any new authorities not already existing and well-defined, then that president is going to have to work very closely with Congress to find a way to fund it, authorize it, and implement it. And so my advice would be to our foreign partners and friends and allies to stay engaged during this coming transition period, to keep your networks as broad and as wide open as possible, and do not focus solely on the incoming administration, but continue to develop your ties and maintain your ties with the members of the Senate and the House of Representatives, because the Congress must, by our form and system of government, must be fully involved. It's easy to think of the bully pulpit of the president representing the lone voice in terms of United States policy. But in fact, it's a partnership, an uneasy partnership, a fractious partnership, one that requires debate and compromise. But it's that way on purpose. It's that way to put these checks and balances in place. And so my advice would be maintain and develop as many avenues of access to both the executive branch and the legislative branch as you can. The term of the president, as we all know, is 4 years at a time. A lot can happen in 4 years. And this first 100 days or the first 6 months sets a tone. It establishes the personality of the presidency, but it does not define the legacy. That's going to be enacted over the entire 4 years. It's going to require a close collaboration with partners, allies, with members of Congress, and with the American people. And so once again, my advice would be establish as many avenues of dialogue with the American people, the administration, and the Congress as possible.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Professor.
It's my pleasure. Thanks very much.